Roughly 12 years ago, my family returned from a 2-week trip through northern Morocco, carrying 2 small ceramic tiles that we had no business bringing home. We had spent most of the trip moving between Fez and the surrounding hill villages, the kind of places where the streets narrow until 2 people cannot pass each other without turning sideways, and the walls hold a coolness even in August that the open air cannot account for. Toward the end of the trip, a man my father had known for years, a local craftsman named Idris, who had done business with him intermittently for nearly a decade, invited our family to his home for a farewell meal. He was generous in the particular way that people are when they want to honor a friendship, rather than simply observe it. Before we left that evening, Idris disappeared into a back room and returned carrying 2 objects wrapped in cloth. He set them on the table and unwrapped them slowly, with a deliberateness that I remember noticing even then. They were tiles, roughly square, each small enough to hold in one palm. They were old in the way that only handmade things become old, worn smooth at the edges by decades of handling, their surfaces carrying geometric patterns pressed into unfired clay and stained in faded ochres and deep brown. Each one had a symbol at its center that Idris did not explain and that none of us thought to ask about. He told my father only that they were very old, perhaps 4 or 5 centuries, that he had acquired them from a man in a village outside Meknes who had needed money more than history, and that he wanted us to have them as a memory of Morocco and of his friendship with our family. My father accepted them graciously. We wrapped them again in the cloth, tucked them into a carry-on bag, and flew home to Edinburgh 3 days later. The first month back, my father dismissed what was happening as the natural disorientation of returning from a long trip. The second month, he stopped dismissing it. My mother, who had never had trouble sleeping in her adult life, began waking at the same time every night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, with a feeling she described as the room being wrong in some way she could not locate. Not a sound, not a presence exactly, simply a quality to the air that did not belong to a bedroom in a terraced house in a quiet part of the city. She would lie there for an hour or 2, unable to return to sleep, and come downstairs in the morning with the gray look of someone who had spent the night working at something exhausting. My father's business, a small importing operation he had run successfully for 11 years, began to unravel in small ways that compounded into large ones. A long-standing contract fell through after a miscommunication that should never have happened. A shipment was delayed at customs for reasons that were never satisfactorily explained, costing him a client he had held for 7 years, then a second client, then a third. He was not a superstitious man. He had not been raised to attribute misfortune to objects. But I watched him during those months begin to develop a kind of watchfulness I had not seen in him before, a habit of going still in the middle of ordinary tasks, as though listening for something. My younger brother Oliver, who was 17 at the time and had the health of someone who rarely thinks about health, developed a persistent illness that his doctor treated as one thing and then another without much conviction. He missed 6 weeks of school. My younger sister, 13 then, became frightened of her own bedroom in a way she could not articulate. She began sleeping with the light on. She began sleeping in my parents' room. She was not a child who frightened easily, and I developed, with no prior history and no clear cause, a problem with my left hand. A tremor that appeared first in the morning and eventually throughout the day. The neurologist I saw said it was stress-related. I was 22 years old, and I had not been under unusual stress before we returned from Morocco. We were not talking about the tiles. Not yet, but they were there, sitting on a low shelf in my father's study, and I think each of us had begun, privately and without saying so aloud, to notice where they were in any room we entered. It was my mother who first said it out loud. She said it carefully, almost apologetically, the way someone states a thing they know sounds unreasonable, but feel compelled to state regardless. She said she kept thinking about the tiles. She said she knew it was irrational. She said she thought we should find out if there was anything to know about them. My father, to his credit, did not laugh. He reached out to a woman named Dr. Fatima Al-Said, a historian he had encountered years earlier through his import work, who had spent 20 years researching material culture and artisan traditions in the pre-colonial Maghreb. He sent her photographs of the tiles and described where Idris had said they came from. Her response, when it arrived, was longer than he had expected. She wrote that the symbols on the tiles were consistent with objects produced in a specific tradition associated with particular families in the hill regions of the Middle Atlas during the 16th and early 17th centuries. She wrote that these objects were not decorative in origin. They were made as household protection objects, embedded into the walls or foundations of homes during construction, intended to stay in the structure they were made for indefinitely. Removing them from the building they had been placed in was considered, within the belief system that produced them, a serious disruption, not merely of property, but of a kind of compact between the physical and something less easily categorized. She was careful with her language. She said she was reporting the belief system, not endorsing it. But she also said that objects like these came with an expectation of return, that they were not made to travel, and that the tradition that produced them included specific understandings about what happened when they left the ground they were made for. Then she told my father how to send them back. The instructions were precise and, to us, deeply strange. Each tile needed to be touched to the skin and held there long enough to warm slightly from the body's heat. A few drops of blood from the palm of each family member needed to be pressed gently onto the surface and allowed to dry. The tiles then needed to be wrapped in natural cloth, no synthetic material, and returned to Moroccan soil, ideally to the region they had come from, ideally placed rather than mailed, but placed if mailing was unavoidable. My father read this to us at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. My mother, who holds a postgraduate degree in biochemistry and approaches most claims with calibrated skepticism, looked at the tiles on the study shelf through the open doorway for a long moment. Then she said, "I think we should do it." We did not do it immediately. My father's instinct was the same as all of ours. The blood element sounded theatrical, and the most obvious explanation for Dr. Aused's recommendation was that she knew someone in Morocco who would be very pleased to receive 2 antique tiles from the Middle Atlas. We were skeptical in the particular way educated people are skeptical about things they have not yet been frightened enough to take seriously. We waited another week. In that week, my parents drove to my father's office on a Tuesday evening to retrieve some paperwork he needed. On the way home, a car ran a red light on a junction they had used hundreds of times and struck the passenger side of their car hard enough to push it 20 feet across the intersection. My mother was shaken and bruised badly along her left side. My father had a hairline fracture in his right wrist and a laceration on his forehead that needed stitches. Neither of them was gravely hurt, but they sat in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours, looking at each other with an expression I had never seen on my parents' faces before, an expression that had moved past the threshold where skepticism feels like a reliable place to stand. When they came home, my father went directly to his study. He picked up one of the tiles. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything. He put it back down. But the following morning, he called Dr. Aused and asked her to explain the return process in more detail. We did it on a Friday evening in the kitchen. My father had contacted Idris and Fez and explained, with some difficulty, what Dr. Aused had told him. Idris had gone quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said, in a voice that my father described as sounding much older than his usual voice, "Yes, they should come back." He arranged for a cousin near Magness to receive the package and place the tiles somewhere appropriate. He did not say where. My father did not ask. We each held a tile against our skin, one at a time, in a silence that had a quality I cannot describe except to say that the kitchen did not feel entirely like the kitchen. My mother heated a needle. We each pressed a drop of blood onto the surface. Not much, barely a mark. The tiles went onto cloth, natural cotton from an old shirt my father cut up for the purpose. We wrapped them and boxed them, and my father took the package to the post office the next morning. What followed is the part of this that I have thought about most in the years since. Within 10 days of the package leaving our house, My father's business began to recover. Not slowly, not incrementally, but with a sudden reversal of the losses that had been accumulating for months. The client who had left came back, unprompted, with a better contract than the original. My mother slept through the night, for the first time, in what felt like half a year. My brother Oliver recovered completely within a fortnight, and his doctor, looking slightly puzzled, said whatever had been causing the persistent illness appeared to have resolved. My sister returned to her own bedroom. The light went off. My hand stopped trembling. I have thought about this for 12 years, and I am no closer to a settled conclusion. I know what the rational accounting looks like. Stress and anxiety presenting as physical symptoms, resolving when a source of collective household tension was removed. Confirmation bias shaping how we remembered the timeline. The natural cyclical recovery of a small business. A neurological tremor that remitted on its own schedule that happened to coincide. I know this account exists. I find parts of it genuinely persuasive. But I also held those tiles in my hands and felt something that I do not have neutral language for. I also watched my mother, who has spent her career in a laboratory, press a drop of her blood onto a piece of very old clay without irony or hesitation, because the alternative was no longer available to her sense of proportion. The tiles are back in Morocco now, in the earth or the walls of some building in the Middle Atlas, where they were made to be. We have not been back to Morocco since. I do not think we will go back soon. Idris and my father still speak occasionally, the comfortable, intermittent contact of a long friendship. They do not discuss the tiles. There seems to be an understanding between them, unspoken and mutual, that some things are better left at the point where they resolved rather than turned over again for examination. I keep a piece of plain terracotta on my desk now, smooth and unmarked, made by a potter in the town where I live. I bought it at a market on an ordinary Saturday. I know exactly where it was made, and exactly how long ago, and exactly who made it. I keep it there to remember what it feels like when an object has no history that doesn't belong to you. My daughters are 9 and 7 now. When this happened, they were 3 and 5. We had moved into our house in a quiet suburb of Dublin about 6 months before, a modest 2-story place with a garden that backed onto a narrow lane lined with old sycamores. We had taken it quickly, perhaps too quickly, the way young families do when they find something affordable in a decent school catchment and the landlord doesn't ask too many questions. My older daughter Rosie had always been a reserved child, slow to speak in full sentences, content to communicate in a private mixture of gesture and half-words that my husband and I had learned to read the way you learn a second language, imperfectly but adequately. Her sister Nell was 2 years younger and chattered constantly, but without much precision, the way small children do when the engine of language has started but the steering hasn't caught up. About 3 months after we moved in, I began to notice Rosie doing something unusual. There was a corner of the sitting room, the far left corner near the old fireplace that we never used, where the wallpaper had begun to lift slightly at the seam and the light from the window didn't quite reach. It was not a remarkable corner. It held nothing. We had pushed a small bookshelf near it, but left the corner itself empty because the proportions of the room made furniture look awkward there. Rosie began walking to it. Not every day at first. Once or twice a week, she would stop whatever she was doing, cross the room deliberately, and stand in the corner looking upward at the ceiling. She would stand there for a minute or two, moving her lips, occasionally laughing at something. I assumed it was an imaginary friend of some kind. Children of that age construct interior worlds that bear very little relationship to the one the rest of us inhabit, and I had learned not to interrogate Rosie's interior world too closely, or she would simply close it off from me entirely. But then she walked over to where Nell was sitting on the rug, took her by the hand with the purposeful gentleness older siblings sometimes deploy toward younger ones, and led her to the corner. Nell looked up immediately, not as if she was following her sister's lead and performing the same action out of imitation, but as if she had seen something there at once, something that already had her full attention. She began laughing, a particular laugh that I knew precisely, the high delighted sound my children made when my husband came home unexpectedly in the middle of the day, or when their grandmother appeared at the door with biscuits. The laugh of a child who has been surprised by someone they love. Both of them stood in the corner looking upward, talking in their particular blend of half-language, holding their toys up toward the ceiling the way children hold things up to show an adult who is standing above them. I set down the laundry basket I was carrying. I watched them for what was probably 90 seconds, but felt much longer. Then I went over and crouched down and asked them what they were doing. Nell just kept laughing. Rosie turned to look at me. She said, in a sentence that was clearer and more fully formed than almost anything she had said before, in a voice that had none of the usual hesitation or reaching for words, "It's your Nan, Mummy. She wants to see us." I should explain about my grandmother. Her name was Dorothea, though everyone who knew her called her Da. She raised 4 children in a small house in County Wexford with very little money and very few complaints, which is a form of heroism that tends to go unrecorded. She was a woman of strong opinions, terrible jokes, and an absolute inability to leave a room without touching the faces of the people she loved. She was the kind of person who made you feel, when you were with her, that you were the specific person she had most wanted to see. She died when I was 26, 4 years before Rosie was born. She never met either of my daughters, or so I had always understood. I stayed crouched on the sitting room floor for a moment after Rosie said what she said. The clarity of it was as startling as the content. Rosie did not speak in complete sentences at that time. She was 4 years old and still working through the basic architecture of language, still substituting sounds for words she couldn't reach yet. To hear her say something that direct, that precise, in a tone of easy certainty, was like watching a child who has never walked simply stand up and run. I looked at the corner. There was nothing there that I could see. The wallpaper lifting at the seam, the dim angle where the wall met the ceiling, the ordinary geometry of a room in a house where we had lived for 6 months and where nothing unusual had ever happened before. My daughters were still looking upward, still smiling. Eventually I called them away from the corner, more to give myself something practical to do than because I needed them elsewhere. I told them it was time for their program. Rosie picked up the toys that had collected on the floor near the corner, the small plastic figures and the board book she had been carrying, and placed them tidily on the shelf nearby, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone completing a task properly before leaving. Then she took Nell's hand, and they went and sat on the sofa. I stood in the kitchen doorway, looking back at the corner. After a moment I said, very quietly, so quietly my daughters almost certainly didn't hear it, "Hello, Nan." The window in the corner, the small side window set into the wall near the fireplace that faced the garden, swung open on its latch. We kept it closed. The latch was stiff enough that I had to use both hands to shift it. There was no wind that I could feel from where I was standing. The curtain moved slowly, and then was still. The room felt different after that. Not frightening, heavier and softer at the same time, like the air just before rain arrives, charged with something that hasn't quite yet declared itself. That night I dreamed of the house in Wexford where my grandmother had lived. I was walking the path behind it, the one that ran alongside the vegetable garden and down toward the low stone wall at the bottom of the property. It was summer in the dream, the particular green-gold summer light of that part of Ireland in the long evenings, and everything was still and warm and very clear. At the end of the path, near the old wall, there was a structure I didn't recognize from waking life. A simple open shelter for low stone pillars and a slate roof, open on 3 sides, with a wooden bench seat hanging on chains from the ceiling like a porch swing. The bench faced the wall and the fields beyond it. I walked to it. There was a small clay dish on the wall's flat top, the kind used for incense, with a thin thread of smoke rising from it that bent slightly in a direction opposite to the wind. I sat on the bench. It swung gently under my weight. I looked at the ground and at the grass and at my own hands, the way you do in dreams when you are trying to orient yourself. Then I saw her shoes. They were the shoes I knew best from childhood, soft brown leather slip-ons that she wore every day in the house, worn at the heel and slightly misshapen on the left side, where her foot had pushed the leather out of shape over years of wearing. They were the shoes I had last seen lined up beside the bed in the room she died in, placed neatly by someone's hand, probably my mother's, parallel to each other on the floor. My grandmother was sitting beside me on the bench. She was wearing the blue cardigan she wore every Sunday. Her hair was the way I remembered it best, white and soft and pinned back simply. She was smiling, the particular smile that had always meant, I know. I see you. There is time. I began talking immediately. The way you talk to someone when you have been storing things up for a long time and the opportunity to release them has suddenly arrived. I told her about the girls. I told her Rosie's full name, which included her middle name, which was the name I had chosen for my grandmother and had told almost no one about. I told her about the corner of the sitting room and what my daughters had said, and I watched her face while I told her, and her expression didn't change at all, which was itself a kind of answer. I told her I had tried to get back to Wexford before she died and hadn't made it in time, and that I had been carrying that particular piece of guilt ever since. She sat and listened without interrupting. The bench swung very slightly. The incense continued its thin thread upward. When I stopped talking, she reached over and put her hand on mine. The same gesture she had made 1,000 times when I was a child and sitting beside her on a different bench in a different garden. Her hand felt exactly as I remembered it, warm and dry and very certain of itself. After a while I told her there was more I hadn't said yet. She nodded, as if to say, I know. There's always more. Then someone called my name from somewhere behind the house, a voice I couldn't identify, not urgent but clear. I turned to look. When I turned back, she was gone. The bench continued swinging for a moment on its own momentum. I stood up and walked to the wall, and there was a wooden door set into the stone that I had never noticed before. I pulled it open. Behind it was a shaft, vertical and vast, extending upward and downward without any visible end, lined entirely with doors on every side, hundreds of them, all closed, each one slightly different from the others, as though behind each one was a different room or a different place or a different time entirely. I stood looking into it until my name was called again. Then I woke up. I was crying before I was fully awake, which is a particular experience. That moment of returning to consciousness already mid-grief, not knowing yet what you are grieving, but feeling the weight of it fully. I sat up in bed and pressed my hands over my face and let it happen for a few minutes, the way you sometimes have to. My husband was asleep beside me. The house was quiet. Downstairs, the sitting room was dark and still. My grandmother died in the spring of 2003. She was 79 years old. I was 26 and living in Dublin, and I did not reach the hospital in time. My daughter Rosie was born in the autumn of 2007. Her middle name is Dorothy. She was born 11 days before the anniversary of my grandmother's birthday. The original due date, which had been calculated 3 weeks earlier and then revised, would have fallen on the birthday itself. I don't know what to make of any of this. I don't know what framework is large enough to hold it comfortably without either dismissing something true or claiming more certainty than I have. I am not a religious person in any formal sense, though I believe in the persistence of love in a way that feels less like faith and more like observation. What I know is that my daughter, who was 4 years old and still assembling the basic tools of speech, turned from a corner of a room I had never thought twice about and told me clearly, without hesitation, in a voice that sounded entirely unlike her usual voice, "It's your Nan, Mummy. She wants to see us." And that a window swung open by itself after I said hello, and that I held my grandmother's hand in a dream, and it felt exactly as it always had, warm and dry and completely steady, as if no time at all had passed, as if the distance between then and now was simply a matter of direction rather than permanence. Rosie still sometimes stops near that corner, not as often as she used to. She is 9 now and more interested in other things. But occasionally I see her glance toward it in a way that isn't random, the focused glance of someone who has noticed something specific rather than simply looking at a wall. I don't ask her about it anymore. I just say quietly when I pass, "Hello, Nan. Thanks for looking in." And I mean it.